Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Felicia Wong, and I have the great pleasure of running the Roosevelt Institute. And I am so pleased that you've all taken time from your day to talk with me and my two colleagues and friends, Joe Stiglitz and Darrick Hamilton, about the current state of the economy and what it's going to take to build back, given all that we are suffering from COVID and its attendant effects. The way the show is going to work today is this. I'm going to introduce Joe, who needs no introduction, but I will just say that he is a Nobel laureate in economics. He is a university professor of economics at Columbia University, and he is Roosevelt's chief economist. Joe will talk for about 10 minutes about the current state of the macroeconomy. Then I will spend a little bit of time talking about the True New Deal, the Roosevelt Institute's policy proposal for what it's going to take to build back better. And then I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Darrick Hamilton, who is a professor at the New School focused on stratification economics. He is also a fellow at Roosevelt. And Darrick will talk about the importance of inclusion as we think about building a better economy and a better democracy. Then we'll take questions from all of you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Professor Stiglitz. Joe, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. This is obviously a very unusual situation. We've never had a economic downturn as severe as this one in terms of the speed of collapse. There's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. At the beginning in February, there was a lot of hopes of that. I always thought it was a fantasy. Anybody who knew a little bit about epidemiology knew that was not likely. But the CARES Act, our series of bills that were done in March and early on, were all predicated on the assumption that it would be a quick recovery. The programs were designed to end at the end of June at the latest. We now know we're in September, late September, and we just passed the 200,000 mark of deaths, and the economic downturn has been devastating. The increase in the unemployment. Unemployment is still very elevated. So there's a lot of uncertainty going forward, both about the depth and the duration of the pandemic itself, but also about the economic aftermath. So what I want to spend a few minutes doing is first talking about what previous downturns have taught us, and then what makes the COVID-19 crisis different. What we've learned from previous economic downturns is that government help is absolutely essential. That the longer and deeper the economic downturn, the greater the damage, the harder the recovery. If there is not enough assistance from government, the recovery will be all the more difficult. And the reason for this is very simple, that as long as the economy is weak, there are devastating effects to the balance sheets of households and of firms. Many firms will go bankrupt. And as long as that continues, the harder it is for there to be recovery. Markets don't recover quickly on their own. And of course, all of this is looking at it just from the macroeconomic perspective without focusing on the suffering in the meanwhile. And one of the things that I'll come to in a second is it's very apparent that this downturn has been marked by a great deal of suffering. Already, even though we're just a few months into this pandemic, there are fears that have been raised about the size of the deficit. We did put a lot of money in, some $3 trillion, and the Federal Reserve provided more support. And this has resulted in a record deficit to GDP ratio. And some people think that we ought to, as a result of that, stop government support. That would be an enormous mistake. The cost of that for the future of our economy and the future of our society would be enormous. A few people are also worried about those large debt and deficits translating into inflation. That's, again, something that we don't need to worry about now. What determines inflation is excess demand, and there are no signs of excess demand. If a few years from now that happens, we have the tools. We have the tools to deal with it, both through monetary policy and through tax policy, through imposing wealth taxes, progressive income taxes, financial transaction taxes, progressive capital taxes. So there are a whole host of tools at our disposal if that should be a problem. But the Federal Reserve has made it clear that they don't see this as a problem anytime soon. In fact, they're moving much more to trying to make the markets assured that the interest rates will be low for years to come. So this is a common element in any economic downturn, no matter what the origin, whether it's a collapse of the financial markets, like in 2008, collapse of the stock market in 1929. There are a common characteristic, and we've learned a great deal. But there are some things that make COVID-19 crisis different. It is a shock on both the demand and the supply side. It's having disparate effects on different sectors of the economy. Most importantly, it's having disparate effects on different groups within our society. This is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after certain groups, particularly those with pre-existing health conditions, poor health status, and because the United States is the only advanced country that doesn't recognize healthcare as a basic human right, and because income inequalities are so great in the United States, the poor health conditions of so many Americans has provided a fertile field for COVID-19 to try to take advantage of. The inequalities in our society that were already huge will almost surely be made greater unless the government does something. And they will particularly be made greater the longer the economic downturn, the economic aftermath of the pandemic continues. And so that's another reason why it is so important to have strong government support. Finally, there's a great deal of uncertainty. Of course, every economic downturn is marked by uncertainty, but this is perhaps more than usual. In the Great Depression, FDR said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." In this particular economic downturn, and we have the disease to fear as well. And we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know when we're going to be able to get an effective vaccine. We don't know whether people are going to take the vaccine. There is much that we do not know. And we don't, because this is such a distinctive type of economic crisis, we don't know about either the politics of supporting the economy or the economic effects of different programs. We've seen that some of the programs have been much less effective in the United States than elsewhere. Many of us thought that it was absolutely essential to keep workers linked with their jobs. We thought that the PPP program was poorly designed to do that. There were other programs that were much better designed, programs along the lines of Denmark and New Zealand. Those countries have succeeded much better than we have. But this uncertainty is having a very significant effect. It is one of the reasons that the savings rate in the United States in the second quarter, the most recent quarter that we have data for, soared to over 25%. This in a country where the savings rates have traditionally been 0 to 5, most 7%. Precautionary savings. On the part of firm, there's also precautionary behavior. They're not making investments. And I'll come to in a minute to talk about what are some of the implications of that. But it is very clear that one of the implications is the government needs to do what it can to resolve, to minimize some of the uncertainties. And we haven't been doing that. So that brings me to the final set of issues, what we can do to have a more effective recovery. The first thing is we obviously need to have, government needs to have much more support. The government programs that were adopted in the early spring need to be reformed, but they need also to be renewed and they need to be augmented. They were not comprehensive enough. We left out state and local governments. One of my earlier analyses pointed out that if we leave these out, parts of our society that are the front line in dealing with education and health, welfare, we won't be able to return to a robust economy. In fact, we should have seen that from one of the lessons of 2008. Even by 2019, employment in local and state governments was not back to where it was before the 2008 crisis. One of the major sources of increases in unemployment are from state and local governments. And yet this is exactly the time where we need more activity. We need more teachers to deal with the challenges posed by distance learning. We need more healthcare workers. So the absence of that, it will ensure a weak economy. So we need to make our programs more comprehensive. Another example is one of the sectors that is very important to our future are our knowledge sectors. Not just primary and secondary education, but universities, research institutions, and they are being devastated by the pandemic. Major sources of revenues of our universities, colleges are being hit. And again, there simply was not adequate support for these institutions. The second thing we need to do is make sure the support that we have provided in the beginning is continued. It was a big mistake. It was cruel, but it was also a macroeconomic mistake not to have continued the support for unemployment insurance. We did that in the 2008 crisis. We said that there would be continued national support for the unemployment insurance system as long as unemployment levels remain elevated. We should do the same in this crisis. Well, the fact that there are these distinctive aspects of COVID-19 means that it will be especially important in this crisis to target particular sectors and target particular parts of our economy, those that are most vulnerable. There's a lot of discussion of a K-shaped recovery, reflecting the fact, as I mentioned before, that the pandemic is having a disparate effects on different groups. And ironically, it is hurting most those at the bottom, and those, many of whom are the frontline workers, essential workers in our society. So if we are going to, we have to recognize that a very large part of our population, the bottom half, is living paycheck to paycheck. On the other hand, the upper part is engaged in enormous precautionary behavior. And we have to have different programs addressing these parts, the different parts of our income distribution. Well, one of the distinctive aspects of the response to the pandemic is the size of the programs. Never has the government intervened in the economy on the scale that it has. And that means citizens have a right to demand that the post-pandemic economy accord with their values and vision. At the same time, the pandemic has exposed weaknesses, flaws in our system. And that's why the slogan that Vice President Biden has put at the center of his campaign, Building Back Better, reflecting a vision of the future, a more equal society, a more resilient economy, a greener economy, a more knowledge-based economy. Why that Building Back Better is absolutely essential. We can make our money that we're spending on the pandemic serve dual purpose or triple purpose. It can help us recover, and at the same time, it can help us restructure our economy in the way that we'd like for the 21st century. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Joe. As always, grounded in the facts and extremely sobering. You know, I think that what you lay out, the economic situation you lay out, the social situation that you lay out, raises a key question, which is really, will our solutions meet the scale of the problem? Right? Will they meet the scale of the moment? You suggested many important macroeconomic policies that will begin to provide some level of relief. But I think it is just worth reviewing the bidding here. We've got 30 million Americans claiming unemployment. We've got a Black unemployment rate that is close to 15%. And more fundamentally, as you said, all Americans are left with this lack of certainty. We fundamentally have no sense of when we might reopen or what it might look like when we quote reopen. You know, are jobs still going to be bifurcated? Will the financial sector still be at the top part of that K-shaped recovery while the rest of American workers, will they be stuck in low-wage retail at the bottom of that K? You know, will big corporations still dominate and call the shots? We absolutely must have solutions that make sure that these conditions are beaten back. Because, you know, really it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm gonna take a few minutes now before Darrick joins us. I'm gonna take a few minutes now to talk about some solutions that really do hold the bar high, in addition to the solutions that you put on the table. Because a month ago, the Roosevelt Institute put out a package of 9 ideas. We called it a true New Deal, and that package was built on the best of the FDR legacy, that New Deal of the 1930s and 40s. That effort and our proposal recognizes a couple of key things. First, changing policy requires changing power. And second, that government shouldn't just incentivize the market and hope for the best. We can actually provide public goods directly. We can afford it, as Joe just suggested. And we can actually design public goods to improve the lives of workers, to improve the economy overall, and to improve the health and the future of the planet. There are some things, of course, about the 1930s New Deal that we must not replicate. We can't replicate the kind of racial and gender exclusions and segregations that we saw earlier in the 20th century. But there are a lot of good lessons to be learned from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. So, as I said, we put forward, we're a think tank, so of course we put out 9 policy ideas. I just want to go through 2 of them today to give some examples of what we mean by policies that hold the bar high enough. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of direct public childcare, and then about the idea of federal charters for large companies. So let's talk a little bit about childcare for just a second. We know, every parent knows, every grandparent knows, every teacher knows, every kid knows that our childcare system today is absolutely unsustainable in the United States. We don't have enough childcare, and the childcare we have is too expensive for families, and at the same time, childcare workers are underpaid. It's this crazy system. And that's in large part because policymakers have treated childcare as a private problem to be solved by individual families. The public sector just doesn't spend enough money on childcare relative to other OECD countries. We're actually 3rd from the bottom in public spending. But there's a solution to this. We could open public childcare centers. The United States did this in the 1930s. Those ran basically through the 1950s. The Roosevelt WPA operated nursery schools. We could call them nursery schools again. That would be fine with me. And so the idea that we have now is that federal funds could build new centers. And we could actually focus those new childcare centers on places in America that are childcare deserts. We could provide millions of childcare jobs that would be public, they would be high wage, they would have access to unionization. You could have childcare jobs that are a lot like teachers' jobs today, and this would create millions of high quality jobs and employment opportunities, especially for women, especially for Black women and women from immigrant communities. Could really be a game changer for families and for women who need work, people who need work. But in this case, it's mostly women. So that is one idea, public childcare centers. Here's another idea. We could have federal charters for corporations. And in this case, the problem to solve is that, generally speaking, the relationship between corporations in America and the American public, that relationship is fundamentally broken. You know, in good times, companies reward executives and shareholders. And in bad times, companies expect and then receive bailouts. Workers are very rarely the beneficiaries. And we've certainly seen that since the beginning of the pandemic. But again, it doesn't have to be this way because by law, corporations are creatures of public permission. Legal term of art, but that really means that corporations are allowed to act as they are because we, as the public and our government, make a decision that corporations act under XYZ set of legal parameters. So we could require that large corporations, say corporations with over $1 billion in annual revenue, we could require them to act according to federal charter. Right now, the law is that corporations are chartered by states. We could require instead federal guidelines for large corporations. You can imagine a charter, well, let me say first that a charter would actually, this would create an enforceable legal obligation so that corporate boards would have to, for example, consider and balance the interests of all of a company's stakeholders, workers, vendors, the larger community rather than focusing narrowly on the interest of shareholders. So you could require worker representation on boards, or you could require that boards have committees such that workers' needs are taken directly into account. You could require disclosure of a company's political and lobbying activities. You could require what Judge Leo Strine, who not coincidentally just retired as the Supreme Court Justice in the state of Delaware, where many companies are chartered, but you could require what Judge Strine calls EESG disclosure. How is a company doing with respect to its employees, its environmental policies, its social and governance practices? So that's another idea, corporate charters for companies. You know, there are a lot of ideas out there, and what this really requires is opening our political imagination. You could have sectoral bargaining for workers. So workers who work, for example, at fast food companies or other kind of retail companies that are spread out across America could actually have access to union jobs. You could have a federal jobs guarantee. You could have a public option for capital so that the federal government can invest in green infrastructure and create jobs in new green manufacturing areas. You could cancel student debt. You could make sure that rent is forgiven for people who are hardest hit by COVID and have those, both student debt and rent, paid for by federal funds, which would be inexpensive these days given record low interest rates. There's a lot of things we could do. And so let me just close by reiterating the point that I made at the beginning, which is to say that now is the time to hold the bar high. Any solutions worth implementing must absolutely prioritize the needs of those who have obviously suffered the most from the pandemic: Black workers, immigrants, women in low-paid jobs, small business owners without the money in the bank or access to credit. You know, recently we've seen that up to 30% of the small businesses that have closed in New York City might never come back. So this is just unacceptable, and it's also unnecessary. We have to remake our systems of economic governance so that all of the people who are historically excluded or historically do not have a voice actually get seats at the table, set the agenda, and get the outcomes that they demand. I'd submit that this is both good policy and good politics. The tens of millions of Americans who are suffering in countless ways from this pandemic and from all of the conditions that were in place before the pandemic would, dare I say, would be loyal to a president who can actually solve their real life problems. I think we can do it. I think it requires the political will. I think we should make sure that that happens. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Darrick Hamilton, to talk about the importance of inclusion specifically in any policy agenda that we put forward.
As always, thank you, Felicia. Thank you for this platform and the privilege also to share stage with you and Joe. You both are some of my favorite scholars, favorite leaders, as well as favorite people in general. In addition to federal corporate charter, we should also think about worker-centric industrial policy rather than such an emphasis on firm-centric industrial policy more broadly. So the mortality rate from this coronavirus pandemic for Black people is more than double that of white people. 45%, nearly half of Black-owned businesses have already fallen casualty to the pandemic. With Blacks making up about 13% of the population and the death total reaching above 200,000 to date, this would suggest that we've already lost over 50,000 Black lives to the pandemic. I wonder if the political response to the pandemic would be different if the face of mortality were less Black. That the impact of something presumably random, such as a pandemic, however catastrophic, can be so linked to one's racial identity, that's highly problematic and indicative of a nation that's failing miserably. This links to a larger political and economic vulnerability, whether we're in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained in the American political economy and has everything to do with the massive racial wealth gap that we see today. Right now, we should be doing everything to protect the public health and to keep workers, including gig workers and micro businesses, in place, as well as promoting aggregate demand. And we need to establish the building blocks for a transformative, secure, inclusive, and more equitable economy so that we will be less vulnerable to the next pandemic or some climate-related catastrophe and the everyday vulnerabilities that most of us live in. That would be the true New Deal that Roosevelt put out. We can say with certainty, based on the recent history of economic downturns, as well as our current economic structures, that the aftermath of this pandemic will result in greater inequality and despair, particularly along racial lines. That is, unless government acts to change this reality. So how did we get here? We do not have an adequate social safety net in place. What we have is decades of deregulation, lower taxes on the wealthy, and a gutting of government services and social welfare programs. For the last 45 years, essentially all the gains of America's increasing productivity have gone to the elite and upper middle class, while real worker wages have remained roughly flat. The promise trickled down from neoliberal supply side economics. It has never come to fruition. Although never fully extended to Black people, as Felicia pointed out, there's nothing new nor radical about the concept of economic rights. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic Bill of Rights. He called for, quote, physical security, economic security, social security, and moral security. Roosevelt knew that, quote, necessitous men are not free men. In contrast, our contemporary political economy, it has radically situated the market as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. We use stigmatization of race and anti-Blackness strategically as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on an underclass based on norms of who is deserving and undeserving. As a result, we have ended up with state and federal interventions, as well as public-private partnerships that attempt to leverage private and charitable resources to manage or incentivize so-called defective Black, brown, indigenous, and poor people to get an education and become more employable. What is glaringly missing from our political economy narrative is the role of power and capital, and how power and capital can be used to alter rules, structures, and transactions in the first place. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without government intervention, they generate iterative cycles of both stratification and inequality. We use words like choice and freedom to describe benefits of the market, but it is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. The bootstrap narrative framed in the politics of personal responsibility as our pathway to upward mobility and efficient social distribution, that might literally be bad for Black people's health. Black men and women between the ages of 25 and 64 have about a 50% higher mortality rate than their white counterparts. But what's even more disheartening, these disparities increase with education. Black men and women with a college degree have a nearly 70% higher mortality rate than similarly educated whites. The unfortunate irony is that Blacks who put forth the highest effort to cope with and deal with circumstances of racism and structural impediments may be exposing themselves to negative health consequences. Economists and policymakers, we need to do a better job of understanding power and capital in our political economy and be more focused on advocating for structures that truly lead to more equitable and fair distributions. We are not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by a free will into fair and efficient allocation. When we look at student debt, it's noteworthy that on average, a Black college graduate 4 years after graduation owes about $53,000 in student debt. Despite being overrepresented in graduate school, fewer Black students begin college and even fewer graduate, and those that do graduate carry much more debt than their white counterparts. So what can we do about this? Analogous to Medicare for All, we could remove the threat and social and psychological stigma associated with the burden of finance at the point of delivery of education, a point in which highly motivated but low resource students are most vulnerable. And we can pursue restorative justice by canceling all debt, all student debt associated with existing loans. We should make public colleges, community colleges, universities, and HBCUs tuition free. If we canceled all student debt, that would provide some stimulus to the university sector that Jill talked about in his talk. To address wealth, baby bonds would establish a universal birthright to capital. The privilege of wealth should not be reserved exclusively to the domain of those born into wealthy families. Baby bonds would provide all Americans with a capital foundation to build wealth and asset security. Reparations provides retrospective, direct, and a parsimonious approach to address the Black-white racial wealth gap. And it also requires the US to take public responsibility and atone for its long history of racial injustice. A seed capital program like baby bonds is a prospective approach. These are complementary programs, and it would in perpetuity trend us towards a more just and egalitarian access to capital and wealth. To address our concentration of wealth and then political power that goes along with that concentration of economics at the top, we need a redistributive wealth and/or estate tax to break up that concentration. There are other bold, transformative, anti-racist and anti-sexist policies that we need, which are intentionally inclusive of all racial, ethnic, and gender groups in order to have a moral economy. We should recognize that there are a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for us to have individual life, liberty, and self-determination, that their quantity, their quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that come about from firms trying to meet their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. What we need are policies where public options directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options, options that do not ensure universal and quality healthcare, housing, schooling, access to financial services, access to capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm because one's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. By mandating an economic right to health insurance, society would effectively remove the burden and stigma associated with finance at the delivery of medical care. Again, a time when a recipient of that care is most vulnerable. Whereas cost and profit considerations drive private insurers to ration the quantity, quality, and access to medical care, such concerns would be recognized and met long before the point of delivery under a publicly mandated system of health insurance coverage. And rather than trying to cajole or bribe a for-profit sector with tax incentives under the fickle contingency of trickle-down economics, we should be looking to initiate the economic right to a productive and quality job with the economic security of a living wage and worker amenities that provide investment, and also jobs that provide investments into our public physical and human infrastructure. I'm not talking about an employer of last resort program, but a viable alternative to undesirable low pay, low benefits, and poor working conditions. The jobs would address our 21st century physical and human capital infrastructure needs, including the provisions of universal care work and addressing our increasingly vulnerability to natural disasters resulting from our unnatural climate change, which all are going to require substantial public investments. We need to reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance, so-called grit, and personal responsibility, that they are the sources of inequality, along with its accompanying neoliberal paternalism in which the government attempts to coerce and incentivize insinuated defective people to behave more accordingly and make better decisions. Indeed, one may question if our societal overemphasis on education to promote economic opportunity, is that a political ruse? In other words, is the rhetorical aspiration of equal opportunity largely a mechanism, a tactic, so to speak, to facilitate the hoarding of resources amongst the elite and the upper middle class? Basically, does framing inequality as an opportunity gap serve the purpose of reinforcing market norms that put the onus of inequality on individuals while absorbing the state from public responsibility? Instead, we need a social movement that changes the paradigm, that's bold, that works at the federal, state, and local levels, that goes into progressive and conservative communities and advocates for programs and initiatives that truly empower people with economic security, with dignity, and authentic agency to define and achieve their desired goals. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Darrick. And Joe and I are going to come back on. We have about 15 minutes for questions. We've got a bunch of questions in the chat. I'm going to read just a couple of them now. Some of them are more political, some of them are more economic. The first question, and if you have questions, you in the audience, please go ahead and use the Q&A function to ask them. I'm going to read two of them because they're pretty different, and then we'll start the conversation from there. The first question is a tough one, but it's the methods you recommend starts with the leaders of this country. What as citizens should we be doing when the current political waters are rife with power and greed? So that's the first question. I'm going to stack a few so we can hear the range of questions. The second question that I'd like to put up there is, what are the main concerns about rising deficits and why are these arguments not correct? Joe and Darrick especially, I'm gonna count on you for that one, although I have my own view of that. Here's a third one, and then let's have a conversation. The third question is, how can we make progress on these policy ideas with power and leadership when those folks are not bought in on both sides of the aisle? And also, which policy would you start with? Green economy, healthcare, et cetera. So let me actually go ahead and take the first question, which was a political question for the most part, about what do you do about power and greed? I'll also say two things about it, and then I'd love to hear Darrick and Joe what you think. The first thing I'll say is that, there's actually some things that we can do to try to make power and greed less legally permissible. You could actually have a new ethics rule that, for example, makes the revolving door, the idea that public servants then just go work for lobbying firms or corporations. You could just actually make that illegal. There are a lot of things you could actually do in that regard. So that's the first thing I'll say. Second thing I'll say is that you could also think about the various structural democracy reform pieces that a number of allies and the Roosevelt Institute have put out there. You can think about ways, right now one of the problems is the system actually does not allow for the majority to get what the majority wants. And so you could do things like consider reforming the Electoral College, reforming the court system, which many people have been talking about over the last few days, and abolishing the filibuster. So these are some things that actually could make the current system more democratic. But Darrick and Joe, any other thoughts about what we should do about the fact that the system right now is rife with power and greed? I'm making the argument that public service should be for public servants, shockingly. But what do you all think? Darrick, I see you might want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think the structural arguments that you just put forth are spot on. You know, there's the famous line that Roosevelt had during the New Deal, which is make me do it. So at the end of the day, I think we need social movements to make them do it. As it relates to racial coalition, you know, I think ultimately young people are starting to redefine economic value beyond our neoliberal definitions that center self-interested behavior at the top, in which case we end up with accumulation with no bounds and a tribalism where people are willing to, unfortunately, trade off horizontal positioning for vertical positioning by saying things like, at least by having a society where people can say, at least I'm not Black. So in other words, we need to redefine economic good to incorporate morality, sustainability, and human dignity. And those aren't pie in the sky ideas. They're actually happening when you see a movement of people in the streets all clamoring together, a global movement that Black Lives Matter.
Great, thanks.
So let me say,
Joe, Joe, take it away.
I think that obviously the most important role is in the political arena as citizens, making sure that our political system works better, and that requires engagement. But there's another thing I think that almost is prior to that, which is a broader civil society movements that change people's attitudes towards every aspects of their life. I mean, we are citizens, but we're also, we buy goods, we're consumers, many of us are employers, we live in a community. So we have multiple roles in our society. And in each of those roles, we can help change the nature of our society so that employers should be paying decent, livable wage to their workers. All of us should be very conscious of how our actions affect the environment, and how, while any one of our actions is too small, collectively, when we all behave in ways that are more consistent with living within our planetary boundaries, we will live more within our planetary boundaries. And when those mindsets change, it'll be easier for the politics to change. So it seems to me that part of this is a broader civil society engagement to try to change mindsets.
Yeah, that's a version of what Darrick was arguing with respect to social movements more generally. It is, I think, that there's, of course, a big debate as to, like, you change policy and hearts and mind follow. Can you do them both all at once? And what is the role? Not everyone's going to be involved in social movements, but what is the role of social movements of inspiring the rest of us to action? So I think those are all great points. Let's go to that question about deficits. Why should we not worry about the deficit? Joe, why don't you take that one, and then Darrick, you could weigh in as well.
Okay, well, there are a number of reasons. What I said before is not spending the money will do more damage than any deficit could do. So, you know, you can say deficits are maybe expensive, I'll come to that in a second, but not having deficits is even more expensive where it will leave our society.
And that's just to be clear, that's because you would end up seeing people without the ability to feed themselves or clothe themselves or house themselves. There would be all kinds of human effects, and there would also be economic effects. People couldn't work, right? And so it would just be a worse version of what we see today.
Exactly, and unemployment will lead to deterioration of skills, poor health, mental health is affected by all the stress we're going through. So all of that is making our economy today weaker, but also our economy in the future weaker, what economists will call hysteresis effects. But now, specifically right now, the cost of servicing the debt with interest rates close to zero is close to zero. So it's not a question of what, you know, can we afford servicing the debt? Actually, the cost of really servicing the debt is minuscule. It's negative. Actually, interest rates are real interest rates are negative. So, and then when we combine that with the fact that many of the things that we can spend money on are investments in our future. So it's not just spending money in any way. I talked about spending money in a targeted way that enhances a vision of our future. Those are investments that increase our productivity. Every firm borrows money in order to grow the firm. And the same thing is true for the nation. You know, it's only right-wing rhetoric that says you should only look at one side of the nation's balance sheet. It is absolutely nonsense.
Right, makes total sense. It's why we've also argued for this public option for capital. But Darrick, did you want to say anything else about austerity, deficit haukery, why it's bad?
Reiterating Joe's point, inflation hasn't been a problem in a very long time. The cost of borrowing is almost negligible for the federal government. But you know, this also brings in the role of taxes. So the purpose of taxes is not necessarily to pay for things, particularly in this moment. We have monetary policy to pay for things, but we can promote a moral budget through taxes. We have too much concentration of wealth at the top, in my view. Perhaps now might not be the exact time to raise taxes on the wealthy, given we're in a pandemic, but at some point we should, because as a result of that economic concentration, it translates into political power. It keeps us from reimagining and implementing a society that would be better for all of us. So there's political reasons for taxes. And then also taxes gives monetary power to our government, that requiring people to use US dollars to pay taxes is what gives us, in part, monetary power. Last thing I want to say is the ways in which we spend dollars from the federal government does impact the manner in which we grow as a society. So during an economic downturn, there's no question we need stimulus because aggregate demand is too low. If it's firm-centric, it can avoid a depression and get us out of a recession, but we could end up in a scenario like we did the last Great Recession, which is greater inequality, which in my view politically led to a despotic leader to come in and run on messages of division as a pathway towards power. If instead we use federal dollars in a way that's bottom up, that invest in our greatest asset, which is our people, not only will that get us out of a recession, but it will promote our shared prosperity while also building our public infrastructure.
Thank you. By the way, Darrick, we've gotten some comments in the Q&A saying that you're totally on fire and people want to see your whole whiteboard. So whatever your big plan for world domination is on the whiteboard, people want to see it. At any rate, you know, I think there's a prioritization question that folks have asked. I think we have time for maybe, I'm going to sneak in 2 questions all at once. There's the prioritization question, and then we have a question, I think it's actually from Jim Roosevelt, who is asking, can the campaign be reframed immediately to make it clear that, you know, a right-wing Supreme Court will make all of these things worse? So that's the second question. But so let's try, we each only have like a minute left. Prioritization. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and say that my priority would be things that people feel. We need to solve the problems that people are feeling immediately, which is why I'd go to job creation. I'd especially go to care job creation. And I would also look to green jobs, since that's something that many people, especially young people, care deeply about. And I would try to do as much as I could, as quickly as I could, to get those priorities up front in the first 100 days, as it were. But Joe, what would you prioritize? And then Darrick, what would you prioritize?
Well, first I would say what I said in my remarks, we have to make sure our money serves dual or triple purpose. That as we're spending money to help the economy recover from the pandemic, we use that money to create more demand for unskilled labor, low-income labor, correct some of the deficiency, the exploitation that has marked our economy, and that we move towards a knowledge and a green economy. So we really have to, resources are inevitably scarce, and we want to make sure that these budgetary resources are used in multiple ways, addressing all of our problems simultaneously. And on the second question on the Supreme Court, what I would emphasize in part relative to what we've been talking about is the way the Supreme Court, the conservative justices in the Supreme Court have been, to use Nancy McLean's expression, putting democracy in chains in ways which make every problem that we're talking about worse. So they've enhanced monopoly power of corporations. They've reduced the power of workers in labor legislation. They've reduced the political power of people and put more emphasis on money. And they made it more difficult to get access to healthcare. So you name it, and they've been on the wrong side of every aspect of the agenda, let alone the much more social issues that a lot of people have talked about. But they've really been on the wrong side of everything that we've talked about today.
Right. And I think reframing the Supreme Court fight in that way could be a useful way to bring it back to a discussion about the economy and about COVID. Darrick, you get the last word. We have like 30 seconds.
Being in a pandemic, we got to first and foremost take care of public health. It's a false dichotomy that positions economic concerns from health concerns. That's silly. Also, we need to get income out to people, keep aggregate demand as high as possible. And then finally, what you said, Felicia, we need a massive jobs program that provides a competitive alternative to bad jobs in the private sector, while at the same time employing people and investing in our greatest resources, which is our people and our public and physical human infrastructure.
Thank you so much. So great to spend the afternoon, an hour this afternoon with both of you and with all of the folks who tuned in. Appreciate you guys, appreciate everybody here, and appreciate your work. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.